last 9 of which as the University of Vermont's Extension Maple Specialist. In this role, Mark is able to leverage his degrees in forest management and plant biology as he leads the UVM Extension Maple program with a mix of original research and outreach activities, and that's what he's doing today. He seeks to bring a more complete picture of current best practices and innovative solutions for the iconic non-timber forest product, which we all enjoy and made in Vermont. Maple syrup, please welcome Mark Isselhardt.
Thanks, John. Thank you, John. Would people prefer I use the microphone? How's the volume? Is this better? Do you prefer that? Yes? We'll start with this. If it goes sideways, just let me know. So good morning. Thank you for having me. My name is Mark Isselhardt. As John mentioned, I work for UVM Extension. I'm based out of the Proctor Maple Research Center in Underhill, but I work statewide, mostly with maple producers, but also folks who are striving to become maple producers and sort of the interested public around issues involving maple syrup. So the talk today is going to talk about what maple syrup is, where we came from, where we are now, and then where we're headed. I always like to know if we have maple producers in the audience too. Some of it might be review. We have a few. So it's not surprising, being in Franklin County, that we would have some. That hasn't always been the case when I've given this talk. So I'd be excited to hear your perspectives. Before we get into the meat of the talk, I did want to acknowledge, so the Extension Maple program that I lead, we focus on 3 main areas. The health and management of sugar bushes, that's the collection of trees where we harvest sap from. Sustainable high yields of sap and syrup, so not just how much you can get no matter what, but what's the amount we can take long term with providing for future generations of these trees. And then also syrup quality. You know, the industry is built on quality. It wouldn't be good if you could produce lots and lots of terrible tasting syrup. The industry would crumble. So along the lines of the program, we do have a website. You can check that out. I'm also happy to introduce a new program that we're doing focused on the quality side. We have a new opportunity for producers to send samples in and get it tested for the basics of grade A quality. That's color, clarity, density, and flavor. Those are the strict regulations we have in Vermont and elsewhere to make sure that consumers are getting what they expect in terms of those quality attributes. So if you're a producer, you want to submit samples, it's free for Vermont producers in this initial phase. You'll get a report on the basics of quality and how your syrup measured up. It's not a sophisticated chemical analysis, but just a check to make sure that the tools and practices you're using are accurate. And unfortunately, we know through years of research that not all the syrup that reaches consumers measures up. So we want to make sure that we're keeping the quality as high as possible. Okay, so on to the main talk. We'll start with a very simple question. Who were the first sugar makers? This is the interactive part of the Indigenous, Native Americans. Okay, I hear pretty good consensus on that one. What if I told you it was likely a squirrel or some wildlife species? So this is actually a squirrel. I took this picture right outside my front door. It's behavior that is known to exist in the wild, where squirrels will systematically nibble off the twigs or injure the bark on maple trees during that period of sap flow. They don't just go ahead and start licking the sap. They actually have a circuit, and they'll come back around after a certain amount of evaporation has taken place, and they'll harvest the sort of sticky incrustations of sugar there. It's entirely likely that those early humans saw this behavior, realized that this was not typical behavior they're seeing the rest of the year, and trying to figure out a way to do it. And I think we're all better for the fact that we don't have to harvest maple this way anymore. Bernd Heinrich, does anyone know that name? A noted biologist at UVM. He did some pretty interesting field research just looking at what was the the calorie count and the mass of these sugar incrustations that squirrels were harvesting. And he found that they were over 55% sugar, these little sticky deposits on the branches. That's more powerful than any reverse osmosis machine capable in the industry today. So pretty interesting to see you have this behavior. Humans likely learned that either from squirrels or bird species that will also do a wounding behavior to harvest this. So what are we talking about? We're talking about a process, now that we're dealing with humans here, we're talking about two very different activities. You have the cultivation of healthy maple trees to harvest this sap in the woods. There's so very much a forestry activity, although we're not harvesting the plant itself, we're harvesting something from the plant. Technically, it's defined as a non-timber forest product rather than growing the tree for a particular attribute like a high-quality saw log. We're actually retaining that plant for a long time. So it's everything from managing the woods, but also the functional part of how do we get the sap from the tree to the point of processing. That's evolved a lot, and I'm going to go into pretty good detail, I think, on that. But then you get to this point, usually at the wall of the sugar house. You go inside, now you turn into high-quality food manufacturers. And you have to follow good safety practices in terms of the food and the quality. You have to make precise measurements of temperature and density and be able to assess color. Historically, both those activities have all been under the same ownership, oftentimes as part of other farm activities. But we know over time that's changed. Some people have a totally different business during most of the year, and only during that sugaring period do they change and do this. So just want to acknowledge that there are two very different activities, historically have always been held under the same ownership, but times are changing and we are seeing people going in with no history of farming in their family whatsoever, but they're captivated by maple, they go into it. Some people are even doing it year round, which was really unheard of not too long ago. So that's sort of the basics of where we're at. I do want to give a little bit of a background on what sugaring is. I know if you live in Franklin County, you know a lot, and some of this is likely to be a review, but I think it's valuable to remind yourself of some of these basic things that haven't changed over time. The first one is you have to wound that tree every year. You can't use the same tap holes year after year. And this is a result of the tree's natural wound response system called compartmentalization. This picture here shows a cross-cut of a stem. Those small brown sort of rectangular shapes, that's the tree's response to that wound. The tree responds with a mix of passive and active activity that chemically walls off that injury and prevents the infection from spreading throughout the tree. That larger area of discolored wood at the center, that's called the heartwood. That's a totally natural process that the tree goes throughout its lifetime. Certain areas will have a small heartwood, other areas will have larger. Species, it matters what species, depending on how big the heart is and the growing conditions. But the actual systematic wounding year after year, that has to happen. If a sugar maker were to inadvertently drill into some of that stained wood, they would get little or no sap from that tap hole. Our research would suggest it's proportional. So say you hit 50% stained wood, you would immediately have a 50% hit on how much sap you'd collect in that season. That's before any of the other things that happen, that often happen in sugaring, where a pump breaks or a squirrel finds your tubing attractive and that sort of thing. But that non-conductive area is something that accumulates over the years. This tree has been tapped for many years. Luckily, the tree grows every year and adds a new conductive wood. So there's a balance there where you don't want to have the intensity of the tapping, the number of taps per tree, exceed the tree's ability to add new wood. So that's one of the ways in which we define a sustainable operation, is that there's a net positive amount of wood growth compared to what's being removed every year. Yeah, there's a question in the back.
If you were drilling above or below one of those holes, would it make a difference?
It would make a difference. Did everyone hear the question? Okay. So it would make a difference if you drilled above and below in so much as if you hit some of that stained wood or not. The variability of that length of that column is quite high. It could be as small as 8 inches or 10 inches. It could be 2 feet. And there's very little evidence from the outside of the tree to tell you what it is. So it's a great question, though. This is going to be a little washed out, I apologize. This is a zoomed in picture of a section of maple, sugar maple wood. I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see it or not, but running vertically, there are some very faint lines. Those are the annual rings. The lines that are moving more horizontally or oriented more horizontally, you might want to make those into annual rings, but those are actually called the ray cells. Those are the cells that hold, technically it's starch, but it's the energy produced in the leaves as sugar gets sent down into these specialized cells to store the energy for the tree's many needs. So that looks like they're annual rings, they're actually not. Those are cells oriented throughout the tree, radiating out from the center, and that's where the tree can tap into these stored resources throughout the year to initiate growth in the spring before it has leaves, to grow new seeds, to make new compounds to protect against injury in the winter. All these things uses that stored energy, and that a portion of that is what sugar makers are harvesting every year. Leaves make sugar. It gets sent down to these specialized cells throughout the tree, not just in the roots. It gets converted to starch from sugar through a process using enzymes, and that's just because starch is a better material for long-term storage, but that starch will get converted back to sugar whenever the tree needs it. It's a pretty fascinating process, and we take a portion of the tree's total stored energy. There are a lot of things we don't know. We don't know with a whole lot of precision how much of the tree's total we're taking, which is pretty important if you're trying to, define something as a sustainable practice or not. We know that tree size has a huge part to play. So as the tree gets bigger, the reservoir gets larger and larger. And since a tap hole is somewhat of a restriction, you can't just have unlimited flow throughout the season. There's only so much you're going to be able to ever take out of a tap hole. Doing some basic back of the envelope calculations, a tree that's maybe 12 inches in diameter, we might be taking less than 5% of the tree's total. But there's a lot of assumptions in that estimate. And the science has not completely resolved it. So the number could be higher for sure. Yeah?
What have we done to that tree for a saw log?
Right, so the wounding absolutely results in this accumulated stain, and that staining will extend as high as it does based on where the human was that could reach to tap it. So if you are in the business of growing clear, straight, high quality saw logs, that will definitely impact it.
Don't tap it.
What's that?
Don't tap it.
Again, it depends on your goals as a landowner or what have you, for sure. Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. So the balancing of that growth and the balancing of that extraction are the two main factors that we think about in terms of sustainability for modern sugaring. There's also a higher level, the sort of more the stand level or ecosystem level concerns about, are we developing a stand that is somehow diminished because of sugaring? That work has not really attracted a lot of careful scientific research. I will say that it's still relatively small in the grand scheme of things. Franklin County notwithstanding, I'll get into the details on that, but broadly speaking, the amount of acreage actually devoted to sugaring is quite small, even if you were to average it out statewide. So, sap collection. This is the way sugaring has been done since before Europeans arrived. Some vessel had to be at the tree to collect the sap during periods of sap flow. Maybe I'm making an assumption, and maybe I shouldn't do that, but there are periods of time during the dormant season when the weather stimulates positive pressure in the tree. This is sort of that caricature of freezing nights above freezing days. It's important to remember that event, that freeze-thaw cycle, is critically, it's the only thing that's going to allow any sort of commercial harvesting of sap using something like a bucket. We call that gravity sap collection. Some years you get a lot of those runs. That period of time when the sap is flowing out of the tree is called a sap run. They're highly dynamic. So if you have a tree that's ready to run, it freezes that night, the next day it thaws out at some point, the sap flows out. Drip by drip, it can be a pretty steady drip, but then if it doesn't freeze again, that pressure equalizes. So the pressure in the tree and outside of the tree are zero, basically equal, no sap flow, until you get another recharge based on temperature. So from the onset of sap flow to when it peters out, that's called a sap run. And there's no way of predicting, and there never have been a way to predict how many of those runs you're going to get in any given season, or when they're going to arrive. Sometimes they're clustered towards the beginning of the season, sometimes they're a little bit towards the end, sometimes they're evenly distributed, sometimes they're all jammed together, and that's always been the case. Yes?
So this is something I don't really know a lot about, but why wouldn't there be a sap collection in the fall? Because you've got that freezing and thawing, and it's in reverse, but...
Yep, that's a great question, and you absolutely can. We actually have a couple of dozen trees tapped right now at the Maple Research Center in Underhill. The issue is, do you have a good enough concentration of the weather to stimulate flow to make it worthwhile? Because you're making the wound, and it's sort of the ratio of wounding to an effort to get everything up and running versus what you get. Sap in the fall also tends to be far less sweet. So right now, the sap we're collecting is less than 1% sugar. It's about 0.6, 0.7, so that's about 140 to 1 ratio, as opposed to the more typical 40 to 1. So then you have an energy issue, is it worth investing? And then it's sort of a pain in the butt, frankly, to go into a freezing time rather than coming out of a freezing time. Just functionally working with moving liquids and valves and everything, it's frustrating. But people do it to some degree. Yep. Okay, so gravity sap collection requires the ideal weather. And we know the ideal weather is not even places where maple is very popular or produced to a high degree. Some years you just don't have the weather and it doesn't work very well. Other years there's abundant sap flow. And then you go across what we call the maple belt, and some areas just don't have great weather. They have a tradition of making it, but the season might only last a week because of weather patterns, and ends up the season's over. So what I'm talking about here is sort of focused on the Vermont climate, but there are people making syrup in other places that have to be ready, and it can come fast and end fast. So the history, I'll talk to the history of tubing, but I want to introduce the fact that most syrup made now uses tubing and a vacuum pulled on that tubing. The technology to use a bucket still exists. Everyone is welcome to do it. You're also welcome to milk cows by hand if you want. The technology still exists, but there's a reason why some of these innovations came about, primarily labor saving. Yeah?
I'm trying to pay attention, but I must have missed why the cold and the warmth caused the tree to rot.
Right. If you didn't hear the question, I didn't really explain to a great degree how the temperature influences sap flow. It is a bit complicated, so I think I will give you just the most caricature or cartoony kind of definition. The tree has to be dormant, and the wood anatomy in maple is such that you have cells that in most trees are liquid filled, but in maples they are gas filled. When that wood, and it starts in the fine branches, but this phenomenon exists anywhere where that wood is present. When that tissue freezes, you get ice formation in those gas-filled cells. They are hydraulically connected to the vessels we drill into to collect the sap. That ice formation actually initiates a negative pressure on those, I'll call them straws, the ones that conduct liquid. That negative pressure extends all the way down to the ground. So as that temperature at night is going down and down and down, it hits freezing and keeps going, you get this massive drawing up of moisture into the above ground parts of the tree. And then the next day, or whenever it thaws again, it could be a week later, but whenever it thaws again, now you have this reservoir, for lack of a better word, of sap above where it wasn't before. And you have the weight of that sap coming down, coming out of the tap hole, and you have that ice, those cells that now have a compressed gas because the ice in them has taken up space. That gas now expands again, so you have two actions, expanding gas and this liquid column of sap pushing in.
So the sap isn't coming up out of the ground, you're hitting the spout, and
Right. No,
it's coming from the top of it.
exactly. It's what we call stem pressure. What you just described earlier is called root pressure, and that's what we get with birch sap. Birch sap is very much out of the roots. We could spend an hour just on the sap flow, so I don't want to. I want to keep going, but I'm happy to chat with you after if you'd like. If you haven't spent any time in a modern tubing system, I just thought it would be worthwhile, even though we're going to go back in time, just to give you a couple of things here. One way to look at a tubing system is think about it from top down. Think about a watershed where what we call lateral lines, the horizontal sort of flexible tubing, those would be the streams and the rivers, small streams I would say, and then the main lines are the large rivers. So all of this tubing system has to be graded tight, straight, and downhill to allow for the best vacuum transfer and the best production. You have a bunch of fittings to basically combine the vacuum that's in the tubing up into the spout. There's different ways of laying it out, but essentially think about it top down as like a watershed, a river system. Then the main lines will be sized depending on how many trees are flowing through there or tree sap are flowing through there, and they'll go to a collection point or right to the sugar house. The other major technology that has changed a lot in modern sugaring is the use of reverse osmosis. Reverse osmosis is a filter, for lack of a better word, with highly engineered membranes that allow water molecules to fit through the membrane, but not sugar molecules. It's engineered to that specificity. It's the same technology you might have in your house if there was an issue with your water, hardness, or that sort of thing. You can eliminate huge amounts of water, 80, sometimes 90% of the water can be removed using this technology before you have to use atmospheric boiling, which is the main technology we use for making syrup. Anyone who's watched a pot boil knows it's a slow process and takes a huge amount of energy. So this technology, reverse osmosis, was invented in the 50s. It was not invented for maple, but it was very quickly adopted by maple, even in the late 50s, early 60s, because boiling is so energy intensive. Yes?
Some people say it affects the flavor.
Right. Some folks have expressed an opinion that the flavor is different with RO versus not RO. We've done several years of work, and what I would say is if you eliminate all the other variables besides the membrane concentration, it's very difficult for people to taste a difference. But the people who choose not to use RO might also have other parts of their processing which could impact flavor, whether how old the sap is or what type of evaporator they're using or any number of things. But I'm not saying it can't impact it, but it's not extremely well defined, the impact. I will say that this technology is now being used by even the smallest operations. People with even a handful of trees can use, and this is a very small RO. you could just put in, some companies are making them in a compound bucket, just to take some of the water. And I want to illustrate the magnitude here. So this graph, you don't necessarily have to see the actual numbers, but if you can see the blue line, okay, so the y-axis represents how many gallons of that material you need to make 1 gallon of syrup. And the x-axis is the concentration, the density or the degree Brix, how much sugar is in there of that material. It's a pretty exponential curve, right? So if we went to what is typically raw sap, so around 2%, now you're at 44 or 45 gallons of that sap to make 1 gallon of syrup. If you take that just to the very lowest levels that most people would run in a reverse osmosis, so maybe 6%, now it's only 15 gallons to make 1 gallon of syrup. You've taken close to 75% of the water out. The technology costs money, it takes some energy to run it, but it's nowhere near the energy in terms of wood and labor to make that firewood or fuel oil that you have to purchase on the market. And I do want to point out that out here, the further you get out in concentration, the gains are much smaller as you go further out. So at our research center, we do go to 35% sugar before we boil it. So that's less than 3 to 1. But the gains are fairly small as you keep going further out. Those would be the ones that the larger operations, it would make economic sense for them to invest in that, because even a small percentage gain adds up to a huge degree when you're talking about 100,000 taps or something like that. Okay, that's kind of a lot, especially as a baseline. I'm going to go back in time, and this is about time after all, and how we got here. So just a little bit of background. I want to point out that humans were harvesting sugar before Europeans arrived. A lot of those cultures don't have a written record. It just wasn't their tradition to write things down. And so the earliest written accounts come from like the 1500s with French primarily explorers who are arriving here. This is not meant to be an exhaustive chronology, but I thought I'd bring out a few high points. One, interesting that Thomas Jefferson made a point of saying that the colonies might be able to be self-sufficient and maybe get away from cane sugar from elsewhere if we were to invest in maple. Interesting thing too, at that time, and for a period of time until 1818, oh, actually, no, it was 1880. Cane sugar was the more luxury item. That was the thing where it had no flavor. It was only brought out for special occasions. Maple sugar was seen as sort of this rustic, inferior product. One of the reasons why we had a term like Vermont fancy for the lightest grades of syrup, it actually goes way back. The sap that you would create fancy, the lightest grade of maple syrup, if you were to boil that down all the way to hard sugar, it would crystallize in a very light, not a lot of flavor consistency. At the time, cane sugar was worth far more than maple. So that was a sort of interesting historical record. The technology, I mean, maple is basically from when the squirrel started nibbling on twigs and humans saw it, there's been innovation ever since. There was that relatively modest technology of boiling raw sap using natural products like birch bark or clay pots. Europeans brought more metal containers. That increased efficiency, and it's really been that way continuously. So the first sort of evaporator pans that we might recognize, it wasn't until the second half of the 1800s that those became popular. What's important to remember is that there was a huge amount of maple made across the country. It wasn't made in quite the same way, but there was so much farming going on and people doing it in areas where the weather and the trees existed, that you add that all up and you had a huge amount of maple. So actually the high point of maple production in the US was 1860, and we haven't caught back up since. So, like I said, technology has increased over time. What hasn't changed is how important the weather is. Even with modern technology, and I'll give some examples in a minute, even with modern technology right now, weather drives production in a huge amount. And evaporation has always been very important in terms of energy demand and producing a high quality product. That reverse osmosis technology, say we theoretically had a machine that could squeeze it all the way down to syrup density, that would not be maple syrup. By law, heat has to be involved in the process. Because maple sap is not just raw, or not just very thin maple syrup. It's fundamentally something different. And it's not until the heat and the reactions associated with that heat between sugars, amino acids, all the minerals that are in maple sap, those create new compounds, new flavor and new color compounds that we all would recognize as being maple. So a very thick tree sap would violate most of our senses in terms of what maple syrup is. I thought it might be fun, just since we are where we are, to highlight how Franklin County has really been a big role in maple in Vermont. The George Sewell Company, that was started here. And the Sewell Company, that's the founder there, George Sewell, when he was a young man, was involved in making new equipment. So new evaporators, new spouts, even a gas-powered tree tapper. Can you see there? There's actually a little two-stroke motor on the back there, and there's a flexible shaft PTO with a drill bit on it. I mean, it's pre-OSHA, I would say, but those things, that was a big innovation, because before you were talking a bit and brace or some sort of Yankee drill or something. Yeah, a lot of work. So that was happening in Franklin County. Obviously, leader evaporator also had a big part to play. That's evolved over time for sure, but still Franklin County has been a leader in maple for a very long time. Leader was one of the first, actually they had the exclusive rights to one of the early plastic tubing systems that was a product actually of 3M, a company out of Minnesota, the first one to really commercialize it. What I'll say is that this is kind of jumping a little bit around in time, but for so much of maple's history, maple syrup was actually not the finished product. It was actually hard sugar. And that's because hard sugar is more shelf stable. One of the great attributes of maple syrup is there are no additives, there's no preservatives. If you leave it on the counter, yeah, eventually it will mold because it is a natural product with one ingredient. So we've known that for a long time. Hard sugar was the product to produce, other than for like home use, before refrigeration and before packaging was really available to keep syrup fresh. So producers, one of the reasons why they're called sugar makers and not syrup makers is because of this long tradition of making hard sugar. Has anyone heard of the George Carey Sugar Company, Carey Sugar? They're based out of St. Johnsbury. It's what is now Maple Grove. So George Carey was an interesting character, and I can't tell the whole story because I'm not a historian and it's not really my story, but there's a gentleman, Matt Thomas, who does quite a bit of maple history. He has a whole presentation about the Carey Sugar Company. But George Carey was interesting in that he was really at that point where we moved away from sugar makers delivering hard sugar to market and actually delivering syrup to market. This picture here is of what that Carey Sugar Company looked like. Those are, I think, 80-pound blocks of maple sugar. One of the biggest, this is 1938? So in the early 1900s, George Carey really grew that business. And most of that product actually went to the tobacco industry. The vast majority of maple production in Vermont in that early period was going to cure tobacco. There's a really funny story about how he came upon it. It was not a thoughtful business plan and did not do a SWOT analysis. He basically got himself caught with a bunch of maple sugar he needed to find a way to get rid of and struck up a conversation with a tobacco person and the rest was history. But that story is really quite interesting. I urge you to check it out. I do want to point out, so over 100 years ago, just in Franklin County alone, 850 145,000 pounds of maple sugar, and an additional 136,000 gallons of syrup were produced. So Franklin County led the way has led the way for a very long time. The labor of collecting that sap has always been critically important to the sugar maker. There was a time when we had bigger families. There was more, labor that really couldn't say, I'm not interested in hauling sap today. And so that's always been an issue, but people have actually tried to find labor-saving devices further back than you might suggest. So the first documented attempts at a tubing system, if you will, was actually a wooden trough system patented in the late 1700s. You saw this picture here is actually of you won't be able to see it, I apologize, but that's actually a dumping station. So pretty large diameter metal pipes that had a few points throughout the woods where sugar makers could dump their sap into a funnel and it would all go downhill. Not for every tree, but at strategic locations so they wouldn't have to haul it all the way back to the sugar house. In the early 1900s, there was something called the Brower metal tubing system. This picture is of a sugar maker putting that up. It came in sticks roughly 4 feet long. You basically tucked one into the next and you built this tubing system. It did have to be hung by wire, but you can imagine in the woods, metal tubing, 4-foot lengths, there were some issues and it didn't last all that long. There were some people who had fairly significant operations, maybe a couple of thousand taps using this, but it didn't last a huge amount of time. You still see it from time to time in flea markets and antique shops. It was actually produced in St. Johnsbury for a time, but the material it wasn't going to work. So it wasn't until plastic became more readily available that the tubing system really caught on. One thing I'll say, and this is maybe a little bit of a diversion, but the maple industry has been very involved in the issue of quality from the beginning. So not every batch of syrup or sugar is going to taste good. So sugar makers have always taken great pride in what they make and their skill and their ability to deliver a consistent high quality product. This was unfortunately challenged when unscrupulous businesses around the country started putting mostly glucose and caramel color in a container and calling it pure maple syrup. At the time, there was no law saying they couldn't do it. There were no purity laws. And so in 1906, the Vermont maple sugar makers, as well as sugar makers from around the country, really petitioned Congress, as well as other people concerned about the safety and quality of food in general, and they established the first quality standards for maple. That effort remains alive today in the regulations we have at the state level and the federal level. Just to give you an illustration of how bad it was, at the time that this legislation was being drafted, people said that there was more maple syrup coming out of Chicago than anywhere else in the country. And clearly, not enough trees in Chicago to do that. And so it really was as simple as glucose syrup or some low cost sweetener mixed with some colorant and being marketed as pure maple syrup. So the Sugar Makers Association, as well as other organizations, have tried to maintain that focus on quality. And occasionally there have been times in the more recent past when adulteration has been an issue and people have tried to cut the maple sugar with other cheaper sweeteners. We do have technology to be able to test whether or not that sugar was created in a plant like a grass, like cane or a beet, or from a tree. There's actually a chemical signature on how those sugar molecules are formed, and you are able to detect the difference. Okay, I know it's a little bit of a diversion, but I think it was worth mentioning. So we've already talked a bit, yes?
How does the Canadian regulations of maple syrup affect our regulations?
I won't get into the Quebec system specifically. The grading quality regulations have been harmonized, so they are the same, more or less. But the way the industry is organized is quite different. But I will get to that. Yep. So I've talked a little bit about Franklin County. I've talked about how important Franklin County is in terms of production, how certainly businesses in Franklin County have contributed to the innovation and technology. And this has been happening for a long time. I don't need you to read the numbers. I just need you to know that each of those little dots, those black dots, represent 50,000 taps. Not evenly distributed across the United States or Canada, right? We have these pockets of focused maple production. Franklin County and northern Vermont, Orleans, to some degree, Caledonia County, those have led the way. And it's not by accident. It's product of hard work, it's product of multi-generational farms who use their knowledge and pass it down year after year. But you can have all the knowledge you want, but if you don't have the resource, you won't really be able to have a large or a productive operation. So you have to have the resource. You have to have trees, and you have to have the weather. So the climate and the weather is so critically important. All three of those things need to kind of align in order to have these areas that are really dominant in terms of maple production. The eastern townships, you can see, also pretty amazing in terms of their production. There are other places around the world, or not around the world, but around the Northeast that actually have, on paper, more maple trees, but they're lacking some other parts. Maybe their tradition might be more focused on saw logs, high quality saw logs for an end use of that forest rather than maple. Or maybe the weather during that season isn't quite as ideal to promote lots of sap flow. But as you can see, for 100 years, we've really led the way. What is also, I think I mentioned the 1860s were the high watermark for maple production. It has not been a gradual change since then. Very dramatic loss in production. Does anyone want to speculate as to why? Yeah.
Lead.
Land?
Lead. L-E-A-D.
Lead. Okay, lead. So lead in the processing equipment?
That and the buckets. Yeah.
Buckets, yep. Any other ideas?
Isn't it the sheep? Deforested for
Sheep and deforested, weather, yep. I think there are sort of elements within all of these. If we, instead of maple production, if we were to put farms, number of farms, or farm labor, we'd see a pretty similar curve. It's a transition away from a broad, small diversified farm economy to one that's more focused on fewer farms and other activities, more of a manufacturing economy and so forth. What I really want to point out is, for one, look at the variability across all those years. It is not a smooth line. You could have big swings. Even back in the good old days, I'll say, we still had years that were down and we still had years that were up. And you can't predict ahead of time what it's going to be. So I think that's really important, especially looking forward. The weather during that season is so critically important. The other thing I'll point out is we hit bottom, you might say. It's a little grim, but we hit bottom maybe in the 60s. We didn't go to zero. We were still producing maple syrup, and we were still leading the country, but the average production was quite low. It was kept, that minimum, that foundation for Vermont maple was kept there by a combination. You had the families that were doing it before, and the families who'd be doing it as long as they could. That helped. We also had an influx of new people who were looking for a connection to the land that they weren't able to find where they were living. Some of those people learned from these multi-generation or learned on their own, which is what a lot of sugaring is. You kind of figure it out as you go. Those two groups combined to establish that there was going to be maple into the future. And you can see there was a pretty good long time, decades, where production really didn't change much. But I really want to draw your attention to this period here. This is the last 25 to 30 years, we'll say roughly. There is some dynamic change right there in the last 25 or 30 years, and I want to highlight that for the rest of the talk, if I can. So let's zoom in just on that period of time. So the last 25 years or so. This is, again, maple production in Vermont. What are the few things that you notice about that, that shape of that curve? It's going up. Good. Is it smooth? Is it predictable? No. There's still some variability there, right? Yep. A couple things I want to point out. One, 2012, that dip right there. Can everyone see that dip? Does anyone remember what happened in 2012? Not a hurricane, nope. There might have been some ice, but it didn't make a huge dent in production. That's a pretty significant drop in production. So we had this really unique, it was actually near the poles, the North Pole. There was a unique atmospheric event. It set up this high pressure around much of the northeast US. We had 5 days in the mid upper 70s in March. It was totally abnormal. I think Burlington hit 80 degrees on March like 19th or something, or 20th. Really atypical. And maple absolutely took a hit. One of the biggest things that happens is the tap hole, the sap is sterile in the tree, but once you drill into it, you're open, it's all bets are off. Now you're essentially fighting microbiology. There's bacteria, yeast, mold everywhere in the environment. It's all natural, it's all part of the process. And what happens at the end of the season, those warm temperatures, those populations grow exponentially. But it happens in April usually for a lot of folks. Here we started seeing that activity in mid-March. And once those tap holes get coated over with the slime that is sort of the byproduct of that microbial growth, there's very little going back. You can't really clean it out. The sap quality also goes down. So whereas you might have been making a good tasting syrup, now it tastes off. So huge hit there. We had another down year in 21 that was also tied to warm temperatures. But I'll point out 23, this one only goes up to 24. So the previous year to the last was down. That was actually a year where it was too cold. We had, and what drives the whole crop is the weather taking place where the bulk of production takes place. Remember that picture I showed you from the little dots of all the production? So if the weather isn't good where all those dots are clustered, the crop's going to go down. If it's the other way, if it's a little bit too warm or a little too cold in the periphery of where maple is made, it's unfortunate for those producers and really frustrating, but it's not going to move the needle much in terms of the total crop. So in 23, it was sustained cold well into when we would normally be collecting sap in the northern part of the state. Then when the weather finally did change, we started getting sap flow, the season pretty much ended. It warmed up quick and it was over. So weather still plays, even with the most modern practices that we've ever had, weather still drives the system to a huge degree. The other thing I want to point about this period of change is how that crop is marketed. So at the beginning of this period, about 40% of all the syrup made in Vermont went in a barrel and was sold to another business. We commonly call those packers. These are businesses who buy barrels from lots and lots of farms, blend it, and then sell that blended product on the marketplace. It's blended with pure maple syrup. It's not maple and other sugars. But at that time, about 40% of the crop was bulk. 10 years later, that had grown to 80% of the crop. So that growth in production is largely coming from operations that are selling in bulk. 88% in 2020. And that's probably closer to 90 or above 90% now. That's just a function of who's investing in production tends to be the largest operations. And marketing is hard, takes a lot of money and time and expertise, especially, try selling a quart of syrup in Franklin County. It's a pretty saturated market, right? So you need to have skills that have nothing to do with leak checking, running a hydrometer, carefully working in your woods, all those things. Marketing is not usually one of the skills that sugar makers, attracts people into sugaring. And so it's far easier to put that high quality syrup in a barrel and sell it to a business that really invests in that marketing. So it's definitely a big change in how the crop is marketed. I think we'll probably continue to see this. That's not to say you can't go in and still make a high quality product and sell it directly to the consumer. That is absolutely fair game. It tends to be on the smaller side of operations that do that. What's great about the maple industry is there really isn't much of a barrier to entering. You can, maybe this talk or some other thing strikes you and you say, well, I want to get into it. You can definitely, around here, there have no shortage of places to buy the equipment and to get some expertise and jump in. Anyone can do it. If you're selling that product, or even if you're not, you need to make sure you're making a quality product, because the average consumer has no sense of how this is made or who's making it. So everyone has a part to play in making sure the industry is strong and has a good reputation. And what's important is not the scale of your operation, but the quality of the product. One of the things I do with my job is judging maple contests. So we had the Champlain Valley Fair contest, and I was there doing some education, and a family came in. They went to look at their entries, and they were looking around, and they found theirs, and they were really excited because they didn't get rejected. They said it was their third year in a row. The first 2 years they were rejected for some defect, maybe color or flavor. And this is the third year, and they didn't get rejected. They were really happy. They had 8 trees, and they really were passionate about it, and they were really excited. And they didn't know this because the containers all looked the same on the contest, but they were right next to an operation from Franklin County that has 85,000 taps. And they both have the same quality. They both measured up, and they both have a role in making sure that the maple industry has this well-deserved reputation. So I think that's pretty interesting. Again, I don't want to overdo it on the Franklin County side of things, but I will point out, if Franklin County was a state and not a county, which I'm sure there's probably some who would love to be their own state. I'm not weighing in one way or the other on that, just stating the facts that if they were a state and not a county, it would be the #2 maple producing state in the country. So Vermont, following Vermont, all other counties but Franklin County would be #1, and then Franklin County would be #2. That can be explained in part, oh yeah.
Excuse me, are there federal regulations that's gonna, so all the surrounding communities have to make the same stuff to call it maple syrup?
Yes, there is a federal standard for quality. The Vermont standard is a little bit higher, a little bit more rigorous to meet, especially for density. But there has been a period of harmonizing the grades so that, yes, you can't have an inferior product called maple syrup in another state and taking away from the reputation.
So how do you distinguish Vermont syrup from New Hampshire syrup?
Well, it has to be made in Vermont if it's called Vermont syrup.
Who's policing that?
That would be an agency of agriculture thing. Yep. It's written into the maple regulations. It has to be.
No doubt it is.
Yeah.
I've been a lifetime farmer, and I've been regulated to death, and enough's enough.
So I guess I can't really, that's just the way it is. Yeah. Oh, I hear you. No, I absolutely hear you. Yep. One of the reasons why Franklin County is, I talked about the resource, the knowledge, the weather. This map here, those colored squares are properties within Franklin County, and it's estimated that 50% of the tappable woods are actively being tapped in Franklin County. That's far above anywhere else in the state. The statewide average might be around 12% or so. Could be lower. A little bit depends on how you define if it's tappable or not. It used to be you'd never go way up high on the hill to get, it would always be closer because if you had horses or you had to get the sap down there, tubing is allowed for a little bit, tapping in different areas. But Absolutely. It's a huge, maple is always huge in Franklin County. And we're actually seeing an effect of that, because when you ask some sugar makers in Franklin County, you tell them 50%, they say, okay, well, where's the other 50%? You know, it can be hard to find properties that are open for tapping, and we're seeing the influence of this in, to some degree, Chittenden County, definitely Lamoille County. So the price that sugar makers are paying to landowners to lease that land, we're seeing the numbers go up. In Franklin County, $2 a tap per lease per year is not uncommon. Statewide, it's $1.
Is this on a pipe system?
Yes, yep, pipe system, yep. And we're seeing not $2 a tap, but closer to that in places like Lamoille County, where the sap is actually being hauled up to operations here in Franklin County. Yeah, you had a question?
Has the quality of the grading of maple syrup changed over the last few years?
Well, it was about 10 years ago that there was a change in how the words, the actual attributes didn't really change, but the language around it changed. And it was done after about a 10-year process, not just in Vermont, but elsewhere, trying to get more consistency across where maple is made. The system that was in place previously involved grade A, grade B, grade C, and at least between A and B, that was seen as confusing to consumers. Consumers were tested through that process, and they would think that there was inferior quality for B compared to A, whereas it still takes as much time and sometimes even harder to make good quality grade B than it is, you know, earlier in the season. And consumer demand was growing for darker, stronger flavored syrup. So a bunch of different things kind of combined. It wasn't the first time the grades had changed. There have been multiple changes over time. Yeah. Yes.
I have two questions.
Okay.
The first one is, there must have been a program a couple hundred years ago to plant maple trees along roads. Do you have any knowledge about the program?
Are you identifying that there's a lot of big old maples along the roads? Yeah.
And it's obvious they've been planted.
Well.
Because they're spaced all.
Yep. I mean, I think there was an acknowledgement whether they're planted or everything else was cut.
Everything else was cut.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not familiar with the specific program that would have resulted in that, but I do know, the gentleman mentioned the sheep farming. You know, we had a landscape that looked very different than we have today. You know, we were 80% or more, deforested. And so what remained in a large degree were these productive forests called sugar bushes. So it's unlikely that you would have had a maple tree cut, and so maybe there was a period where there was more investment in planting.
And the second question I wanted to ask you is, a few years ago, there was an experiment. They were recording harvesting sap from saplings.
Yep. So the question is about the sapling method for harvesting sap. Yeah, I was involved in that work. Based out of the Proctor Maple Research Center. Tim Perkins and Abby Vandenberg were the ones who initiated that work. Very different approach to harvesting sap. These were maybe 2-inch diameter saplings, the top cut off and a flexible cap put on. Has to use vacuum to suck it out of the top. We did a number of years of work, mostly proof of concept. Could you do it? But there's no one doing it commercially. The cap itself was never really adopted by any equipment companies and produced at any kind of commercial scale. You can do it, but it's still a lot of work. But that would be a very intentional planting at a very systematic way. You could theoretically produce a lot more sap per acre than you do now in a more wild setting, but no one is doing it commercially. Good question for sure. That's actually a good lead-in. I will say that going forward, so the things that are going to drive production in the future, are some of the things that are influencing it now. And I want to point out that tree is a big one. The size of the tree really drives production. So the bigger the tree, more sap you get. Those saplings produce very little sap, but if you could plant them at a high density, you would get more sap per acre. The relationship is about, in more typical sized trees, about 2 gallons of sap per inch of diameter. You're probably familiar, if you're at all familiar with sugaring at all, that there was a time when we would say, okay, based on this tree's diameter, we're going to add this many taps. A lot of that is rooted in gravity sap collection. Think about the wood in the tree. That's a restriction to flow. It doesn't just flow out like air out of a balloon. It comes out quite slowly, drip by drip. That means that there's only so many hours of the day when sap is running where you could harvest sap. So if you have a big tree, you need to put multiple holes in that tree in order to optimize how much sap you get for the time, in the time allowed before the next big uptake of sap. It's not like there's a fixed volume of sap up there and it just takes you 6 to 8 weeks to get it all out. It's this pulsing of liquid going up into the tree and then down. We know there's a point at which you keep adding, if you added 15 taps to a tree, you don't get 15 times more sap than 1 tap. It diminishes as you go higher in number of taps. So those guidelines that say 1 tap per tree up until about 20 inches and then another one after that to maybe 28 or 30, those are related to the logistics of getting sap out in a reasonable time. It's very different when you start adding vacuum. We know the vacuum propagates across the stem, so you can influence individual tap holes very differently than if it was just on gravity. So our guidelines now, using modern high vacuum, is 1 tap per tree, regardless of how big the tree is. You could add a second one, but the tree has to be very healthy, be putting on adequate growth, and a bunch of other things have to be in place in order to justify that second tap. Because that, under high vacuum, you might get 30% more sap from that second tap, but you're not doubling by any means. You're doubling the wounding, but you're not doubling the sap flow. So we've dialed back the tapping guidelines to be more reflective of how modern sugaring is done, again, in hopes of trying to be a little bit more sustainable in how we're harvesting. The other big technology, vacuum. So that equipment there probably doesn't mean anything to you, but that's an example of a vacuum pump. The relationship between the intensity of the vacuum applied to the tap hole and how much sap you get is very linear. The more vacuum, the more sap. But you can only, there's a limit. There's only so much vacuum you can pull in the tap hole. The limit is whatever the barometric pressure is on any given day. And we know that fluctuates, right? You listen to the weather, the barometric pressure is this, or it's this, and it's changing. No matter how big your vacuum pump is, you can't pull higher than whatever the barometric pressure is. So that limits it. And the relationship is about 5 to 7% more sap for every inch of mercury. That just happens to be the unit of measure for vacuum in this case. The old days, when tubing was first coming on, largely it was repurposed dairy pumps that were used. These were designed to be turned on a couple of times a day at milking. They were not designed to run 24/7. They were also not designed to pull really high. That would not go well with, with the cows. So they were not designed for high intensity vacuum or continuous use. Pumps like this are designed, they're designed to be in a hospital or some other industrial setting where they just run all the time, constantly. So the intensity of the vacuum and how the sugar maker chooses to run those pumps also influences yield. We've done work where we looked at different levels of vacuum. We actually cut the trees down, looked at the internal staining, and found no relationship between the intensity of the vacuum and the amount of staining. That tissue is pretty robust. So we're not damaging the tree internally. We're not making a bigger wound. What makes a bigger wound is adding multiple taps per tree. Which, depending on your point of view, big maple or industrial maple, it can be concerning. Scale of operations can be concerning. But what I tend to point out is when you look at that road, that country road where you've got 3 or 4, sometimes 5 buckets on a big old tree, that's pretty intense for those trees because you have to put a new hole for every single bucket every year. And there's only so high you're going to hold a bucket realistically to harvest the sap. So,
Depends how deep the snow.
absolutely. Yep, yep. But there's a pretty narrow band of where you would theoretically put a bucket compared to a modern operation where you have a very long piece of tubing we call a drop line to really stretch and reach where you can tap. So,
One more question for Mark.
Yep.
Is that about it?
There's been, a big thing now about microplastics. Have there been any studies done on maple syrup after going through all these plastic tubes?
right. There has been some work looking at the impact of tubing that's been sanitized or not sanitized. Sanitation in maple is designed to limit the amount of growth in the tubing, and that can then get sucked into the tree during freezing events and shut down the sap flow system. That's not exactly what you're talking about, so there hasn't really been much done. We know that, microplastics are everywhere, so there's every reason to believe there might be some in maple. I think it comes down to how much you're consuming and to what degree it actually exists. But there hasn't been a lot of work done on that. No, that's a good question. I know we're kind of short on time. I did want to point out 2 things. One, the Quebec system is incredibly important. We probably could have talked for an hour on that. Just Quebec alone is responsible for over 70% of all the syrup made in the world. So they have market share and they have an appetite for collective arrangement. So they have a very supply management based system in Quebec. They have one organization, the Quebec Maple Producers. It's government sanctioned, it's all legal, but producers in Quebec have to sell their crop to this organization, unless they sell just tiny bits like farm gate kind of sales. If they sell syrup in a barrel, it has to go to this one agency. So they control supply, and they also assess a financial fee for every pound. Bulk syrup is bought and sold by the pound, not by the gallon. Every pound of syrup sold to this organization gets assessed an additional fee for marketing and research. So it's basically like a checkoff program you might have here for other ag products. We don't have one in maple, but functionally it's like that. They have also added what's called a strategic reserve of maple syrup. And it is what you might think. It's barrels and barrels and barrels of syrup. They've all been hot packed and carefully stored. They can store this for years. And they do. So years where we have down years, like 2012 or 2021, they can release some of it into the marketplace and stabilize supply. They have so much in storage that they can actually predict the price regardless of what the weather will be in the future year, which is really unprecedented before that time. The price is paid in Canadian dollars, and so since the average consumer doesn't recognize, average Franklin County notwithstanding, the average consumer does not recognize where maple syrup comes from or particularly cares. They just want their quart of syrup at Costco in Phoenix to be $9.99. So if it's Canadian syrup, fine. If it's US syrup, fine. They don't really care. So the price paid to producers outside Quebec tend to align with the Canadian price because the consumer demand has not really risen to the point where Vermont has a premium. So if the Canadian dollar is weak, the Vermont producer or producers outside Quebec tend to take a hit.
Are there other places in the world that make maple syrup?
Not to any significant degree, no. Okay, I know I'm just out of time. Last 2 things I want to point out. Growth in maple, 2 things. Growth in maple, we do see more consumer demand for less processed or clean labels. So I think the future is bright for more people being interested in maple, maybe not at home on their pancakes, maybe as an ingredient in other foods. They want something that isn't highly processed and full of preservatives. So we're seeing increasing demand. The other thing I'm really happy about is the next generation of sugar makers. I've been really pleased to work with the tech centers around the state. These are 2 examples of students working. We do an annual maple competition where the different schools, Cold Hollow comes, and Green Mountain, and Hannaford in Middlebury, and they compete against each other on their basic knowledge of sugaring and their ability to set up tubing systems and really reflect what the future of maple is. So I think the future, despite the threats, I think the future is bright. So thank you very much.